Imagine this. It's 1939 and Europe is about to explode into the deadliest war in human history. Now picture a young British stockbroker, 29 years old, standing on a train platform in Prague. He's not a soldier. He's not a spy. He's just a guy with a briefcase and a desperate plan. In his hands, he holds a list of names, 669 names, each one a child marked for death by the Nazi machine. And he has weeks, maybe days, to get them out before the borders slam shut forever. This man will orchestrate one of the most daring rescue operations of World War II, saving nearly 700 kids from the gas chambers. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. He never told anyone. Not his wife, not his children. For 50 years, the world had no idea what he did. His name was Nicholas Winton, and this is the story they tried to bury. Before we dive into the impossible mission, let's rewind to understand just how insane the stakes were. In 1938, Czechoslovakia was a democracy, a beacon of hope in Central Europe. Jewish families lived normal lives, kids went to school, parents worked, dreamed, planned futures. Then came Munich. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain shook hands with Adolf Hitler, and Czechoslovakia was handed over like a business deal. Appeasement, they called it. Betrayal is what it was. By March 1939, Nazi tanks rolled into Prague. Overnight, Jewish families became targets. The Nuremberg laws kicked in. No jobs, no property, no rights, no future. Parents watched their children's faces and saw only one thing coming: oblivion. The borders were tightening. Countries across Europe were slamming their doors. America had strict quotas. Britain was reluctant. Switzerland turned people away at gunpoint. For Jewish families trapped in Prague, there was no cavalry coming, no last-minute rescue, just the slow, horrifying realization that they were alone. But Nicholas Winton wasn't supposed to be there at all. He was a London stockbroker, a guy who traded bonds and lived a comfortable life. In December 1938, he was planning a ski vacation in Switzerland when a friend called him with a desperate plea. Come to Prague instead. See what's happening. Help if you can. Winton changed his plans. He arrived in Prague and walked into a nightmare. Refugee camps overflowing with families who'd already fled from Austria and Germany, parents begging strangers to take their children, kids clinging to their mothers, not understanding why everyone looked so terrified. Winton saw something that would haunt him forever. Thousands of children who had maybe weeks to live unless someone did something impossible. Here's what made Winton different from everyone else wringing their hands about the tragedy. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't form a committee or write letters to politicians. He just started working. He rented a hotel room in Prague and turned it into a makeshift headquarters. He sat at a desk with a typewriter and started making lists, names, ages, addresses. He took photographs of children, passport style, even though most of them didn't have passports. He filled out forms that didn't officially exist yet. He was inventing a rescue operation from scratch, with no funding, no authority, and no government backing. Just a stockbroker with a typewriter and a ticking clock. The plan was simultaneously simple and utterly insane. Winton would organize trains, the legendary Kindertransport operations, to carry Jewish children from Prague through Nazi Germany to Britain. Think about that for a second. He needed to convince the British government to accept hundreds of refugee children during a time when anti-immigration sentiment was sky high. He needed to find families in Britain willing to foster these kids. He needed to raise £50 per child, a small fortune in those days, to guarantee they wouldn't become wards of the state. And he needed to do all of this while negotiating with Nazi officials who could shut down the entire operation with a single signature. Oh, and he had to do it before Hitler closed the borders completely. Time was the enemy, and Nicholas Winton knew it. Every day that passed meant more children slipping beyond reach. The Gestapo was already compiling deportation lists. The camps were being built. The machinery of genocide was warming up, and one man with a briefcase was racing against the Third Reich itself. Back in London, Winton turned his mother's dining room into a war room. Picture this. A proper British home in Hampstead, teacups and doilies, and suddenly it's ground zero for a clandestine rescue operation. Winton worked his day job at the stock exchange, then came home and worked until midnight on the children. He wrote hundreds of letters by hand to potential foster families, to government officials, to anyone who might help. His mother, Babette, became his partner in the operation, helping with paperwork and hosting meetings with families willing to take in refugee children. They weren't wealthy people. They weren't connected to power. They were just ordinary British citizens who decided that doing nothing wasn't an option. The British government had one brutal requirement. Each child needed a foster family, committed in writing, and a £50 bond, equivalent to about $3,000 today. Winton had to find families and money for 669 children. It was an impossible math problem with lives hanging in the balance. The propaganda machine was working against him too. British newspapers were full of headlines about the dangers of immigration, about preserving jobs for British workers, about the strain on resources. Sound familiar? This was 1939, but it could be today's news cycle. Winton faced the same xenophobic resistance that refugees encounter in every era. He had to convince skeptical British families that these weren't dangerous foreigners, but terrified children who would die without help. He showed them the photographs, told them the stories, made it personal. Slowly, agonizingly, the list of committed families grew. Some were Jewish families themselves, understanding the horror firsthand. Others were Christians motivated by conscience. A few were Quakers, driven by their faith's commitment to peace and protection, but there were never enough. For every child Winton placed, 3 more appeared on his list in Prague. Meanwhile, back in Czechoslovakia, the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone predicted. The Nazis weren't just occupying the country, they were systematically dismantling Jewish life. Every day brought new restrictions, new humiliations, new dangers. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Families were evicted from their homes. Men were being arrested on fabricated charges and disappearing into prisons. Parents faced an unbearable choice: keep your children with you and watch them march toward death, or put them on a train to a foreign country where they don't speak the language, don't know anyone, and might never see you again. Imagine being a mother or father making that decision. Imagine kissing your 7-year-old goodbye at a train station, not knowing if you'll ever hold them again. That's what Winton was asking these families to do: trust a stranger with their most precious treasure. The logistics were a nightmare, wrapped in a bureaucratic hell. Each child needed identity papers, travel documents, transit visas through Nazi Germany, and entry permits for Britain. The Nazis were deliberately slow-walking approvals, enjoying the psychological torture of making families wait while the clock ticked down. Winton had contacts in Prague who worked frantically to process paperwork, sometimes forging documents when official channels moved too slowly. They were breaking laws to save lives, always one step ahead of discovery. The British Home Office was barely more helpful, buried in red tape and suspicious of anything that looked like mass immigration. Winton learned to work the system, finding sympathetic officials, exploiting loopholes, sometimes simply wearing people down with persistence. The first train was scheduled for March 14th, 1939. 20 children would be the test run. If it worked, more trains would follow. If it failed, if the Nazis stopped the train or if British authorities refused entry, the entire operation would collapse. Winton had no guarantee of success, only the certainty that doing nothing meant death for every child on his list. The train pulled out of Prague's Wilson station right on schedule, carrying 20 terrified children toward an uncertain future. It crossed through Nazi Germany without incident and arrived in London 36 hours later. 20 kids stepped off that train into the arms of their new foster families. It was a miracle, and it was only the beginning. Success breeds ambition, and Winton wasn't about to stop at 20 children. He immediately began organizing more trains, bigger trains, pushing the operation to its absolute limits. Between March and August of 1939, 7 more trains would leave Prague, each one carrying between 50 and 250 children. Think about the precision required here. Every single child needed documentation, a foster family waiting in London, and the £50 guarantee deposited with British authorities. Winton was essentially running an underground railroad through the heart of Nazi territory. coordinating with volunteers in Prague, navigating British bureaucracy, and somehow keeping the entire operation secret enough that the Gestapo wouldn't shut it down. He worked 18-hour days fueled by coffee and the knowledge that every delay meant more children slipping beyond reach. His colleagues at the stock exchange thought he was exhausted from overwork. They had no idea he was saving lives in his spare time. The scenes at Wilson Station in Prague became increasingly heartbreaking as parents realized this might be their last glimpse of their children. Mothers pinned notes to their kids' coats with their names and ages, as if a piece of paper could protect them in a foreign land. Fathers tried to stay strong, shaking their sons' hands like little men, then breaking down as the train pulled away. Some parents couldn't go through with it at the last moment, pulling their children back from the platform, choosing to keep their families together regardless of the consequences. Others put their children on the train and then collapsed on the platform, sobbing into the steam and smoke. The volunteers organizing the transports had to maintain order, check documents, and somehow keep moving forward while watching this parade of impossible goodbyes. Every child who boarded represented a family being torn apart, a childhood ending, and a desperate gamble that survival in a foreign country was better than certain death at home. The Nazi authorities were watching, and they enjoyed toying with the operation. Sometimes they'd approve exit visas quickly. Other times they'd delay for weeks, demanding additional paperwork or arbitrary fees. They understood the psychological warfare they were waging. Every delay meant more panic, more desperation, more families wondering if their children would make it out. There were moments when the entire operation nearly collapsed. The British government threatened to shut down the transports, worried about the political backlash from accepting too many refugees. Money ran short, and Winton scrambled to find donors willing to cover the bonds. Some of the foster families got cold feet and backed out, leaving children without placement. Winton had to juggle all of these crises simultaneously, never knowing if the next phone call would bring news that the trains had been cancelled or that the borders had closed. But the trains kept running. In April, 162 children. In May, 103 more. In June, another 90. The summer of 1939 saw a steady stream of refugee children arriving at Liverpool Street Station in London, bewildered and exhausted but alive. British families met them with signs bearing names they couldn't pronounce, trying to communicate through smiles and gestures. Some foster families were wonderful, treating the refugee children like their own. Others were less kind, seeing the children as charity cases or free labor. The children themselves had to adapt to everything at once. New language, new food, new culture, new family. Many cried themselves to sleep every night, missing their parents and wondering if they'd ever go home. But they were alive, and that was everything. By late August, Winton had gotten 669 children out of Czechoslovakia. 669 lives saved through sheer determination and bureaucratic wizardry. He was planning the biggest transport yet. 250 children scheduled for September 1st, 1939. The largest single rescue in the entire operation. The train was loaded. The children were aboard. The foster families were waiting in London. Everything was ready. And then, on that exact morning, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later. The borders slammed shut. That train never left the station. 250 children who were literally sitting in their seats, moments from escape, were trapped. Almost none of them survived the Holocaust. The failure of that final train haunted Nicholas Winton for the rest of his life. 250 children so close to freedom that they could almost touch it, sent back to their families and ultimately to the concentration camps. Winton knew their names. He had their photographs. He'd arranged their foster families, and he couldn't save them. This is the part of the story that doesn't make it into the sanitized history books, the uncomfortable truth that even the greatest rescue operations have limits. Winton had performed a miracle, saving 669 lives, but he couldn't stop thinking about the 250 he lost. The war swallowed them whole, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Sobibor. The children from that final train became statistics in the Nazi death machine, and Winton carried their ghosts with him. This is why he never talked about what he'd done. Not because he was humble, though he was, but because he felt like a failure. He'd saved hundreds, but he couldn't save them all. The war years were agony for Winton in ways most people never understood. He joined the Royal Air Force and served as a pilot, but every night he wondered about the children he'd rescued. Were they safe? Were their foster families treating them well? And what about their parents back in Czechoslovakia? He had no way of knowing that most of the parents who put their children on his trains were already dead, murdered in the camps, or shot in the streets during the Nazi occupation. The children he'd saved were orphans now, though many wouldn't learn that truth for years. Some of the kids thrived in Britain, adapting to their new lives and eventually considering themselves British. Others struggled with the trauma of separation and loss, carrying psychological scars that never fully healed. A few were reunited with surviving family members after the war. Tearful reunions at train stations that mirrored the goodbyes 6 years earlier. But most never saw their parents again. The price of survival was permanent exile from everything they'd known. After the war ended, Winton went back to his life. He married, had children of his own, worked in business and later in charitable causes. He helped establish homes for elderly people and worked with refugee organizations. But he never ever talked about the Kindertransport operation. His wife didn't know. His children didn't know. His colleagues and friends had no idea that the quiet, unassuming man they knew had orchestrated one of the most successful rescue operations of the Holocaust. He kept all the documents, the lists of names, the photographs, the letters from desperate parents, stored in an attic scrapbook. Occasionally he'd take it out and flip through the pages, remembering faces and wondering what happened to them all. The children he'd saved had grown into adults, scattered across Britain and eventually around the world. Some became doctors, teachers, artists. Some had children and grandchildren of their own. They owed their existence to a man whose name they didn't know. The secret might have died with him, if not for a twist of fate in 1988. Winton's wife, Greta, was cleaning out the attic when she discovered the scrapbook. She opened it and found herself staring at photographs of hundreds of children, accompanied by meticulous records of names, dates, and foster family placements. She asked her husband about it, and he reluctantly explained what he'd done nearly 50 years earlier. Greta was shocked. She'd been married to this man for decades and had no idea he'd saved hundreds of lives. She immediately contacted a researcher who was documenting Kindertransport stories, and the researcher realized they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. This wasn't just another rescue story. This was the largest single Kindertransport operation from Czechoslovakia, organized by one man working essentially alone. The researcher contacted a television producer, and suddenly Nicholas Winton's 50-year secret was about to become public. The BBC producers had an idea for something special, something that would honor Winton's rescue operation in the most powerful way possible. They invited him to be a guest on a popular television program called That's Life, telling him they wanted to interview him about his work with elderly charities. Winton had no idea what they were really planning. On February 27, 1988, he sat in the audience of the television studio, just another guest waiting for his interview. The host, Esther Ranson, began telling the story of the Kindertransport children, describing the mysterious British man who'd saved them. Winton listened politely, not realizing she was talking about him. Then Ranson asked if anyone in the audience owed their life to Nicholas Winton. Every single person sitting around him stood up. The entire audience. They were all his children. The camera captured everything. Winton's face as he realized what was happening, the shock giving way to overwhelming emotion. He looked around the studio and saw them, his children, now in their 50s and 60s, standing and applauding. These weren't the terrified kids he'd put on trains in 1939. They were grandparents themselves now, successful professionals, people who'd lived full lives because of what he'd done. The woman sitting next to him, who he'd assumed was just another audience member, leaned over and introduced herself. Her name was Vera Gissing. She'd been one of his children, number 419 on his list. She was 10 years old when she boarded the train in Prague. Now she was 59, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. She existed because Nicholas Winton had filled out her paperwork and found her a foster family. The applause continued wave after wave, and Winton sat there trying to process that the people surrounding him represented 669 lives saved, plus all of their children and grandchildren. Thousands of people walking the earth who wouldn't exist without his intervention. The television appearance changed everything. Suddenly, the world knew about Nicholas Winton and his children. The story went viral, though that term didn't exist yet in 1988. Newspapers across Britain and around the world covered the reunion. Survivors from Winton's transports came forward, sharing their stories of that desperate escape from Prague and the complicated lives they'd built in Britain. Some had spent decades not talking about their past, trying to assimilate and forget the trauma. Others had searched for years, trying to understand who had organized their rescue, wanting to say thank you to the nameless benefactor who'd saved them. Now they had a name and a face. Letters poured into Winton's home from survivors and their families, expressions of gratitude that left him uncomfortable. He insisted he wasn't a hero, that he'd simply done what needed doing, that anyone in his position would have made the same choice. But his children knew better. They understood that most people in his position had done nothing. The revelation also brought painful reunions with the past. Some survivors had never stopped wondering about their parents, clinging to faint hopes that maybe, somehow, their mothers and fathers had survived. The truth was brutal and final. Of the parents who put their children on Winton's trains, almost none survived the Holocaust. They'd been murdered in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Treblinka, or simply shot in the streets during the Nazi occupation of Prague. The children Winton saved had been orphans for 50 years, many without knowing it for certain, until researchers tracked down the records. Some survivors had built elaborate fantasies about their parents, imagining they'd escaped to America or Australia, that one day there would be a knock on the door and a reunion. The documentation destroyed those fantasies but provided closure. Their parents hadn't abandoned them. Their parents had loved them enough to let them go, knowing it meant they'd never see them again. That last act of love, putting a child on a train to safety, was the final gift those parents could give. Winton's story also forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth about its own history. While the country celebrated him as a hero, the reality was that the British government had made his rescue operation incredibly difficult. The £50 bond requirement, the strict limits on how many children could enter, the bureaucratic obstacles he had to overcome, all of it reflected an immigration system designed to keep people out, even children fleeing genocide. If Britain had been more welcoming, if the government had waived the financial requirements or processed visas faster, Winton could have saved thousands more. The children on that final train that never left Prague could have made it to safety. This wasn't a comfortable conversation for a nation that prided itself on standing up to Hitler. The truth was messier. Britain eventually fought the Nazis, but first it turned away refugees. The honors and recognition came late, but they came in force. Winton was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 2003, becoming Sir Nicholas Winton at the age of 94. The Czech Republic awarded him the Order of the White Lion, their highest honor. He received the Pride of Britain Award for Lifetime Achievement. Israel recognized him as a righteous among nations, the highest honor given to non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Every award ceremony brought more of his children, now elderly themselves, traveling from around the world to say, "Thank you one more time." They'd created an organization to document their stories and preserve Winton's legacy. They tracked down every survivor they could find, building a database of the 669 children and their descendants. The numbers were staggering. By the time researchers finished counting, they estimated that more than 6,000 people were alive because of what Winton had done. 6,000 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who owed their existence to a stockbroker with a typewriter. But here's what makes Winton's story even more remarkable, and what most people miss when they hear about his rescue operation. He didn't stop with the Kindertransport. After the war, when other people his age were focusing on careers and retirement plans, Winton dedicated himself to a different kind of rescue mission. He became obsessed with creating housing for elderly people who had nowhere to go, building care homes across Britain for those society had forgotten. He worked with charities supporting disabled children. He volunteered with organizations helping refugees from new conflicts, applying the same principles he'd used in 1939 to modern crises. For Winton, saving those 669 children wasn't a singular heroic moment that defined his life. It was just the beginning of a lifetime spent helping people that others ignored. He saw himself not as a hero, but as someone who simply noticed problems and tried to fix them. When asked why he'd organized the Kindertransport operation, his answer was almost frustratingly simple. The children needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. No grand philosophy, no dramatic speeches about good and evil, just pragmatic problem-solving applied to a humanitarian crisis. This mindset reveals something profound about real heroism that Hollywood never captures. Heroes in movies make grand speeches and dramatic sacrifices. Real heroes like Winton just quietly do the work. He never wanted attention, never sought recognition, never thought what he'd done was particularly special. In his mind, the real heroes were the parents who put their children on those trains, making the impossible choice to save their kids by giving them away. The real heroes were the British families who opened their homes to refugee children during a time of economic hardship and anti-immigrant sentiment. The real heroes were the volunteers in Prague who processed paperwork under the watchful eyes of the Gestapo, knowing they could be arrested at any moment. Winton saw himself as just a coordinator, someone who connected people who needed help with people who could provide it. This humility, this refusal to see himself as special, is what allowed him to keep the secret for 50 years. He genuinely didn't think his story was worth telling. The psychology of this silence fascinates historians and psychologists alike. How does someone save hundreds of lives and then never mention it? Part of it was survivor's guilt about the children he couldn't save, particularly those 250 kids on the final train. But there was something else too, something culturally British about his reticence. Winton came from a generation and a social class that valued modesty, that considered bragging about good deeds to be vulgar. There's a famous British expression, "Proper people do the right thing and don't make a fuss about it." Winton embodied this philosophy completely. He'd done what he considered the right thing, helping children escape the Nazis, and he saw no reason to make a fuss about it afterward. The idea of seeking recognition or praise would have been mortifying to him. This cultural context helps explain why his wife and children had no idea about his past. It wasn't that he was deliberately hiding a secret so much as he simply didn't think it was relevant to his present life. Compare this to how modern society approaches heroism, and you'll see how much has changed. Today, people document every good deed on social media, seeking validation and recognition for the smallest acts of kindness. We live in an age of performative altruism, where helping others often seems secondary to being seen helping others. Winton's generation operated under completely different rules. They'd lived through the Great Depression and 2 world wars, experiencing hardship that made them value actions over words, substance over performance. When Winton organized the Kindertransport operation, there were no cameras recording his efforts, no social media posts documenting his sacrifice, no way to monetize his heroism into a personal brand. He did it because children needed saving, and he could help save them. The reward was knowing they were safe, not public recognition or gratitude. This makes his story even more powerful for modern audiences. In a world drowning in performative virtue, Winton's quiet heroism stands as a rebuke to our obsession with recognition. The contrast between Winton's silence and the very public nature of other Holocaust rescuers is striking. Oskar Schindler's story became famous through Thomas Keneally's book and Steven Spielberg's film. Raoul Wallenberg's diplomatic heroism was documented extensively. Irina Sendler's rescue of children from the Warsaw Ghetto was celebrated and studied. But Winton remained unknown for 5 decades, his rescue operation as significant as any of these famous cases, but completely hidden from history. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other Nicholas Wintons are out there? People who did extraordinary things during the war but never told anyone. How many rescue operations, how many acts of courage, how many lives saved disappeared into silence because the heroes didn't think their stories were worth sharing? The answer is unknowable, but it suggests that the history we know about World War II is just the tip of the iceberg, that countless acts of heroism vanished into family attics and unmarked graves. The moment that television appearance aired, Winton's children began organizing. They weren't content to simply thank him privately and move on with their lives. They understood that his story needed to be preserved, documented, and shared with future generations. Survivors formed associations, held reunions, and started tracking down every person who'd been on those 8 trains. What they discovered was extraordinary. The 669 children Winton saved had become teachers, doctors, scientists, artists, business leaders, and parents to thousands more. There was a Nobel Prize-winning chemist who'd been on train number 3, a member of parliament who'd arrived on train number 5, film directors, authors, philanthropists, all owing their existence to a man they'd never heard of until 1988. The descendants multiplied exponentially with each generation. By the early 2000s, researchers estimated that Winton's actions had resulted in more than 6,000 living people spread across the globe. 6,000 souls who wouldn't exist if a 29-year-old stockbroker had gone skiing in Switzerland instead of traveling to Prague. But the story of Winton's children isn't just about numbers and statistics. Each of those 669 kids carried their own trauma, their own story of loss and survival. Take Vera Gissing, the woman who sat next to Winton during that first television appearance. She was 10 years old when she left Prague, old enough to understand that her parents were sending her away, old enough to remember every detail of that goodbye. Her mother made her promise to be brave, to study hard, to make them proud. Vera kept that promise. She learned English, excelled in school, built a successful life in Britain. But she spent decades wondering if her parents had survived, writing letters to aid organizations, checking lists of Holocaust survivors, hoping against hope. It wasn't until the 1960s that she finally received confirmation. Both her parents had died in Auschwitz in 1944. They'd survived 5 years after putting her on that train. 5 years of hoping they'd see their daughter again before the gas chambers took them. Vera had to live with the knowledge that her survival came at the price of never seeing them again. That the last time she hugged her mother on that Prague train platform was truly the last time. Multiply Vera's story by 669 and you begin to understand the emotional complexity of Winton's rescue operation. These weren't just lives saved. They were childhoods stolen, families destroyed, and futures built on foundations of loss and trauma. Some of the children adapted remarkably well, thriving in their British foster homes and eventually coming to see Britain as their true home. Others struggled with identity, caught between the Czech heritage they'd left behind and the British culture they'd adopted. Many faced prejudice and discrimination even after the war ended, treated as outsiders despite having lived in Britain for years. Some foster families were cruel, using the refugee children as unpaid servants or treating them as second-class members of the household. The psychological impact lasted lifetimes. Studies of Kindertransport survivors show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and attachment disorders compared to the general population. Saving their lives didn't erase the trauma of separation and loss. It just gave them the chance to survive it. Yet here's what's remarkable about Winton's children. Despite everything they'd endured, despite the trauma and loss, the overwhelming majority chose to honor their survival by living meaningful lives dedicated to helping others. They became teachers who specialized in helping refugee children adapt to new cultures. They worked with Holocaust education programs, sharing their stories in schools so that future generations would understand what happened. They supported organizations helping modern refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, seeing echoes of their own childhood escapes in today's humanitarian crises. Winton's children understood that they'd been given a gift, the gift of life when death seemed certain, and many felt an obligation to pay that gift forward. They established scholarships for refugee students, funded Holocaust memorials, and worked tirelessly to ensure that their rescuer's story would never be forgotten. In a very real sense, Winton's quiet heroism created a ripple effect of compassion that continues to this day. The reunions between Winton and his children became annual events, held in various locations across Britain and the Czech Republic. Imagine these gatherings, elderly men and women in their 70s and 80s, gathering around a man in his 90s all of them bound by a shared history of escape and survival. They'd share photographs of the families they'd built, the careers they'd pursued, the lives they'd lived because Winton had typed their names on a form in 1939. Some would break down crying, overwhelmed by the weight of gratitude and grief, thanking him for their children and grandchildren, while mourning the parents who'd sacrificed everything to put them on those trains. Winton would sit quietly through these emotional testimonials, still uncomfortable with the attention, still insisting he'd just done what anyone would do. But the evidence surrounding him proved otherwise. Most people didn't do what Winton did. Most people saw the crisis and looked away, overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy or constrained by bureaucracy and prejudice. Winton looked at the crisis and asked himself a simple question: what can I do to help? Then he did it. The legacy of Nicholas Winton extends far beyond the lives he directly saved, reaching into the uncomfortable truths about how nations respond to refugee crises. His story forces us to confront a pattern that repeats throughout history with depressing regularity. In 1939, Britain debated whether to accept Jewish children fleeing Nazi persecution, with politicians and newspapers warning about the burden on society and the threat to British jobs. In 2015, similar debates erupted over Syrian refugees fleeing civil war. In 2022, the conversation repeated with Ukrainian refugees. The language changes slightly. The specific fears adapt to modern contexts, but the fundamental resistance to helping desperate people remains remarkably consistent. Winton succeeded despite his government's reluctance, not because of its support. He had to fight bureaucracy, overcome prejudice, and work around systems designed to keep refugees out. This raises a haunting question. How many modern Nicholas Wintons are out there right now, trying to help people escape violence and persecution, frustrated by the same bureaucratic barriers and political cowardice that nearly stopped Winton in 1939? The documentation Winton preserved in that attic scrapbook became invaluable for historians studying the Holocaust and the refugee crisis of the late 1930s. His meticulous records provided a window into how the Kindertransport operations actually worked on the ground, revealing details that official government archives never captured. Researchers found letters from desperate parents pleading for their children to be included on the transports. They found Winton's financial ledgers showing exactly how he raised money and managed the £50 bonds. They discovered correspondence with Nazi officials, chilling in its bureaucratic banality, as Winton negotiated exit permits for Jewish children with the same regime that was planning their extermination. These documents revealed something that many Holocaust histories gloss over. The rescue operations that did succeed required intense negotiation with the perpetrators themselves. Winton had to play nice with Nazi bureaucrats, following their absurd regulations and paying their arbitrary fees, all while knowing these same officials were implementing genocide. The moral compromise required to save lives within an evil system is something we rarely discuss when celebrating heroes. As Winton aged into his 90s and then past 100 years old, he became a living connection to a history that was rapidly fading from living memory. The last survivors of the Holocaust were dying, taking their first-hand testimonies with them. But Winton remained, a tangible link to those desperate days in 1939 when Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Schools invited him to speak, and he'd address auditoriums full of teenagers who'd never known a world without smartphones and social media, trying to explain what it was like when Jews were being systematically erased from society. He'd show them the photographs of the children, faces frozen in time at ages 7, 8, 10 years old, and explain that most of their parents were murdered. He'd talk about the banality of evil, how genocide doesn't announce itself with dramatic villains, but creeps forward through bureaucracy, prejudice, and indifference. His message was always the same. This can happen again if we're not vigilant, if we allow fear and hatred to override our common humanity. The Czech Republic embraced Winton as a national hero, understanding that he'd saved a generation of Czech Jews who would have been annihilated. Prague named a square after him, installed a statue in his honor, and incorporated his story into school curricula. Every year on the anniversary of the first transport, Czech officials would hold ceremonies at Wilson Station, the same platform where those children had boarded trains to safety. The Czech president personally thanked Winton multiple times, calling him the greatest Briton in Czech history. This recognition meant everything to Winton because it came from the country he'd saved the children from, a nation acknowledging that a foreigner had cared more about Czech Jewish children than many Czechs had at the time. The honors from the Czech Republic also served as a form of national reckoning. Czechoslovakia in 1939 had collaborated with the Nazis to varying degrees, and many Czech citizens had stood by while their Jewish neighbors were persecuted. Honoring Winton allowed modern Czechs to celebrate someone who'd done the right thing, even if their own grandparents' generation had often failed to do so. Winton lived to see his story adapted into books, documentaries, and television films. The 2011 documentary Nicky's Family traced the lives of several survivors and their descendants, showing concretely what his rescue operation had meant across generations. The filmmakers found scientists, artists, and community leaders who existed because Winton had saved their parents or grandparents. They interviewed children who'd never met Winton, but knew they owed their existence to him. One particularly moving scene showed a reunion of descendants, a room full of people ranging from young children to grandparents, all connected by the fact that their family trees traced back to one of those 8 trains. The camera panned across their faces, while a voiceover listed names. Winton saved number 312, who became a doctor and had 4 children, who had 11 grandchildren, who now have 6 great-grandchildren. 21 people alive today, because of one name on a list in 1939. Multiply that by 669, and the scale of Winton's impact becomes almost incomprehensible. Nicholas Winton died on July 1st, 2015, at the age of 106. He lived long enough to see his rescue operation recognized internationally, long enough to meet thousands of descendants of the children he'd saved, long enough to become a symbol of moral courage in an age that desperately needed such symbols. The news of his death made headlines around the world, tributes pouring in from presidents and prime ministers, Holocaust survivors and their families, and ordinary people who'd been moved by his story. The British Prime Minister called him a hero of the Holocaust, one of the greatest Britons who ever lived. The Czech government announced a day of national mourning. But perhaps the most powerful tributes came from his children, now in their 80s, writing letters and giving interviews about the man who'd given them life. They spoke of his humility, his continued discomfort with being called a hero, and his insistence until the very end that he'd simply done what needed doing. Even at 106, even after decades of recognition and honors, Winton had never fully accepted that what he'd done was extraordinary. His funeral was held in Maidenhead, the English town where he'd spent his final years, and it became an international event. Survivors traveled from across Europe, America, and Israel to pay their respects. The Czech ambassador attended, as did representatives from the British government and Jewish organizations worldwide. But the most moving presence was the sea of elderly men and women, Winton's children, who filled the church and spilled out onto the streets. They came in wheelchairs and with walkers, some accompanied by their own children and grandchildren, all of them there to say goodbye to the man who'd saved them 76 years earlier. During the service, a rabbi recited a Talmudic teaching that has become forever associated with Winton's legacy. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. Winton had saved 669 worlds, and those worlds had created thousands more. The mathematical progression of his impact was staggering, a geometric expansion of life, triumphing over the Nazi machinery of death. After Winton's death, his children and their descendants intensified their efforts to preserve his legacy and apply his lessons to contemporary crises. They established the Winton Foundation, dedicated to supporting refugees and promoting Holocaust education. They lobbied governments to adopt more compassionate refugee policies, explicitly invoking Winton's story as evidence that accepting refugees isn't just a moral imperative, but an investment in the future. Several survivors wrote memoirs detailing their experiences, documenting not just the rescue, but the complicated decades that followed, the identity struggles and psychological challenges of children separated from their families. These books added nuance to the heroic narrative, showing that rescue operations, while necessary and praiseworthy, carry their own costs and complications. Saving lives doesn't erase trauma. It just gives people the chance to survive it and build something meaningful from the wreckage. The parallels between Winton's era and our own became increasingly uncomfortable as the 21st century progressed. The Syrian refugee crisis, the largest since World War II, saw millions of people fleeing violence and seeking safety in Europe and beyond. Once again, Western nations debated how many refugees to accept, with politicians warning about security threats and economic burdens. Once again, images of desperate parents and terrified children filled the news, modern echoes of those Prague train platforms in 1939. Winton's children watched these debates with a sense of horrified déjà vu, seeing their own childhood experiences reflected in the faces of Syrian families. They spoke at rallies and wrote op-eds, pleading with their adopted countries to remember the lesson of the Kindertransport. Today's refugee children are tomorrow's doctors, teachers, and community leaders if we give them the chance to survive and thrive. Some politicians listened. Many didn't. The same political calculations that had made Winton's rescue operation so difficult in 1939 were still operating 80 years later. The question that haunted Winton throughout his life, the question about those 250 children who didn't escape on that final train, became a rallying cry for refugee advocates. How many modern equivalents of that train are we watching depart without acting? How many children are we allowing to remain in danger because of bureaucratic obstacles or political cowardice? Winton's story proves that one person, working essentially alone, can save hundreds of lives if they're willing to navigate the system and refuse to accept bureaucratic excuses. But it also proves how much more could be accomplished if governments actively helped instead of creating obstacles. The tragedy isn't just what Winton couldn't save despite his best efforts. It's what could have been saved if the British government had made rescue easier instead of harder, if financial requirements had been waived, if visa processing had been faster. Winton succeeded in spite of his government, and that fact should shame us all. How many lives are being lost today? Because we're repeating the same mistakes, erecting the same barriers, offering the same excuses about capacity and resources while people die. So why don't we know Nicholas Winton's name the way we know Oskar Schindler's? Why isn't his story taught in every school alongside Anne Frank and the liberation of Auschwitz? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how we construct heroic narratives and which stories we choose to celebrate. Schindler's story fits a certain template. A flawed man redeemed through heroism, a dramatic narrative with clear villains and spectacular acts of salvation. It translates easily to cinema, with its bribes and close calls and emotional reunions. Winton's story is quieter, more bureaucratic, less cinematic in the traditional sense. He wasn't bribing Nazi officials or dramatically rescuing people from death camps. He was filling out forms and writing letters and organizing logistics. His heroism was administrative, which sounds boring until you realize that administrative heroism saved 669 lives. We need to expand our definition of what heroism looks like to recognize that the person filling out paperwork to save refugees is just as heroic as the person engaging in dramatic rescues. Maybe more so because administrative heroism requires sustained effort over months and years, not just one dramatic moment. The other reason Winton's story remained hidden for so long is that it fundamentally challenges national mythologies about World War II. Britain likes to remember itself as the nation that stood alone against Hitler, the beacon of freedom when Europe fell to tyranny. That narrative is true, but incomplete. Britain also turned away thousands of refugees, implemented restrictive immigration policies, and made heroic rescue operations like Winton's unnecessarily difficult. Celebrating Winton means acknowledging that Britain could have done more, should have done more, and that many lives were lost because of bureaucratic callousness and political cowardice. That's not a comfortable addition to the heroic narrative of Britain's finest hour. It's much easier to celebrate Winton as an individual hero than to confront the systemic failures that made his individual heroism necessary. Every country does this, selectively remembering the moments when we lived up to our ideals while conveniently forgetting the times we failed. Winton's story demands that we remember both. His legacy lives on in unexpected ways. There's a statue of him at Prague's main train station, depicting him as a young man surrounded by children, forever frozen at the moment when he decided to act. British schoolchildren learn about him now, studying the Kindertransport as part of Holocaust education. The £50 bond that Winton had to raise for each child, adjusted for inflation, has become a symbol used by refugee advocates to highlight how arbitrary financial barriers prevent people from reaching safety. Several organizations now offer Winton Awards, recognizing individuals who help refugees navigate bureaucratic systems. His name has become synonymous with quiet, effective heroism in the face of overwhelming crisis. But perhaps his most important legacy is the lesson that individual action matters, that one person who refuses to accept the status quo can change hundreds of lives. You don't need to be wealthy or powerful or connected, you just need to see a problem, refuse to look away, and figure out what you can actually do to help. The 6,000+ descendants of Winton's children are living proof that heroism multiplies across generations. Every time one of those descendants helps a neighbor, volunteers at a refugee center, or stands up against injustice, they're extending Winton's legacy forward. Every career in medicine or teaching or public service, every act of compassion or courage, traces back in some way to that decision Winton made in December 1938 to cancel his ski vacation and go to Prague instead. This is how real heroism works. It doesn't end with a dramatic rescue. It ripples outward through time, creating waves of compassion and courage that touch lives the original hero never met. Winton saved 669 children, but he really saved thousands of futures, millions of moments of joy and love and connection that wouldn't have existed without his intervention. Try to calculate the value of that, and you'll understand why numbers can never truly capture what he accomplished. Here's what Nicholas Winton understood that we often forget. In the face of massive systemic evil, individual action still matters. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews, an atrocity so vast that individual rescue efforts seem insignificant by comparison. What difference does 669 make against 6 million? But that question misses the point entirely. To the 669 children who escaped, it made all the difference in the world. To their thousands of descendants, it meant existence versus non-existence. The scale of a tragedy doesn't diminish the value of whatever lives you can save. If anything, it makes each rescue more precious, more essential, more proof that humanity survives even in the darkest moments. Winton didn't stop the Holocaust. He didn't defeat the Nazis. He just saved everyone he could reach with the resources he had. That's not a failure of imagination or effort. That's the definition of heroism. Doing what you can with what you have where you are. The rest of us should be so brave.